Let's give them a hand as they come on up. So hello again, my name is Dennis Baker. I'm the Business Program Director. Before we get started, we just say that a big reason we do these is encourage you to create your own work by hearing it from people who've been there, survived, and have stories to share with us. So I'll have you guys first introduce yourself and how you worked on the film.
My name is Stephanie Marin, and I produced it.
My name is Brian Jett. I was the writer and director.
Yeah, nice. So as we know, it takes a tribe and a village and an army to make a film happen. So is there anybody, cast or crew, in the audience that you want to acknowledge? Did you see?
We can't see anything. There's crazy lights. There are cast and crew members. Please stand up because we could not have done this without amazing, amazing humans. And we had a lot of, I know you're here.
Don't be shy. So we're going to jump right into it. So to make a film, you have to start with story and script. That's obviously that starts. So talk a little bit about how the story kind of came to be, kind of the beginning of the writing process.
So it was a couple things. I'd done a film before this that I'm very proud of, but it was 4 intertwining storylines, 52 locations, 50 plus speaking roles on like a 22-day shoot. So it's the only kind of thing you do, like if you're too dumb to know better. I wouldn't recommend doing that. So when it came to the second, I was like, okay, I want to do a movie with 2 characters and minimal sets. So that was sort of the baseline. And then I worked in restaurants for years and years, but I'm not self-aware enough to realize that that is great material. I was actually watching, I don't know if you guys have seen that movie with Tom Cruise, Cocktail, where he's the bartender and spins on the bottles. And I was like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Like, but what happens to that guy in 10 years when he's sort of relived the same night over and over and again, and he realizes that he never went to college and that kind of stuff. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then, so that was cool. And I sort of just thinking about it, and it's like, all right, well, who would get through to this guy, and who would he respond to? And then the idea for Daisy came up, and it's like, all right, well, and then from there, it sort of just built. It's sort of like, all right, well, who are these people? Why are they attracted to each other? Where are they in their lives? And then sort of workshopped it from there into a script form.
Nice. Can you talk a little bit about that? Did you crank it all out in one evening, or was it over a process of days, months, weeks?
No, it was a long process because I think a story like this, because it's not particularly plot driven, it just takes, you really have to get into their skin and sort of know who they are. And then I think the other thing with indie films is you're also writing for stuff like, okay, we're doing this with no budget. What locations do we have? What access to that kind of things we have? So it's trying to meld those two things. All right, well, I have this idea. I have these assets. How do I make those work and still stay true to the story?
And talk a little bit about feedback process. Who'd you go out to gain feedback? Kind of how is that helpful to you? What are you kind of conscious about trying to get feedback as those drafts are getting created?
Well, I think on a sort of movie at this level, you're not getting a ton of feedback because the stakes are so much lower in terms of budget. But I have a group of readers that I trust, that I go out to them, and then obviously Stephanie is an amazing resource and very honest about story and that kind of thing. So you go out to them, and then a lot of it's working with actors. And I think the one thing, stuff that seems so clear to you on the page when you start talking to actors and other creative heads is not clear to them. So you sort of work through it that way, which really helps, and you keep developing it and work on it all the way to when you shoot it.
Stephanie, how do you guys know each other? Talk a little bit about your guys' working relationship and how you guys started.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually go back to
Totally.
just add a comment on what he just said before jumping into that, is that I think the beauty of doing something low budget, and I think that the beauty of doing something that is at the core a writer-director piece, is that this is the movie Brian wanted to make. And it's so easy to kind of say, oh, I want to do something so big, and I want to do something with all this money and all these giant stars. And really what that means is that, in talking about notes, is that there are 1,000 people that all say, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. And then it really takes away from the movie that you want to make. And I think what is beautiful about this movie is that Brian wrote a script and he told the story that he wanted to tell, and that's what makes it what it is, and that's why it is amazing. And it is true to his voice, at least I hope so. I think we all made a really great film, and it wasn't bogged down by a ton of notes, not to distract from the fact that notes are amazing. We know each other from a mutual friend, which also goes back to connections, and you never know who will bring you where. And I was working at a film finance company at the time and met Brian, and I was like, this is a movie I have to work on, and we did it.
Right. And then so when do you know, kind of, Brian, that your writing's ready to start kind of pre-production and start kind of putting the wheels together, including Stephanie, kind of getting your, department heads involved? Kind of talk a little bit about that process. Timeline-wise, when was that for you? You talked about we shot about a year and a half ago, so talk a little bit about the beginnings of that.
I think as a writer, you sort of you get used to sending it out and getting feedback, and you sort of have an intuitive feel for when it's ready for people to see it. So I think once that felt ready, then was when I started approaching the person at staff we met through and that kind of thing. In terms of like department heads, I think it was sort of around the same timeline. And I think on this budget, oftentimes it's your sort of first net you cast is this is neither Stephanie or I's first feature, so we had a little bit of a pool of people that we've collaborated with before that we could sort of go out to first and say, hey, I'm after my first feature, I think I'm very good at helping other people's careers, more than myself. So I sort of reached out to them and said, hey, I'm doing another movie. I know that you're a big deal now, but do you think you might have time for this? And so that's what it starts, and you sort of go from there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest answer is like, who do you know that's great at what they do? It's like the DP I went to college with, and he's amazing and wonderful, and I think did an amazing job on this film. Clearly biased, but I think that he was wonderful, and he was the first person that I suggested to Brian. I was like, I think you should really take a look at Rick, and I think that's how it starts. It's people that you respect, people that you admire. It's like if you don't know that person, reach out to that person, because you don't know that they won't love the script or respond to the script, and I think that's...
Yeah, and I would say the one really nice thing about doing movies at this budget level is nobody's doing it because they're getting a huge payday. They have to respond to the material and doing it because they really love it, which is amazing and just an honor because you know that they're doing that for that reason. So it's really wonderful in that regard.
Talk a little bit about raising the money. How did that go about? Did you use Kickstarter or anything like that? Was it all kind of through private? Go ahead.
The hardest part about filmmaking. We did not do Kickstarter. It's all private equity. And I don't know. It's private equity and credit cards.
Yeah, but we also sort of planned from the script level to try to do it at a level where it was within our means. Like it wasn't going to take the usual 2 years or 3 years, whatever, to raise the financing for it. So that was sort of inherently built into the process from the get-go.
How long was pre-production for you from kind of like when Stephanie got on board to like the first day of shooting? What was the timeline on that?
A day?
It felt like a day. It felt like one really long day.
It was pretty quick, right?
Yeah, I think it was pretty quick. I would probably say...
Or when I don't know.
6 months, maybe?
Maybe. I think it was at least 6 months. I think it was a little less. Our pre-production was actually, once we got geared up and going, pretty quick. But I think that's just a testament to the cast and crew that we had on board as well. It's like once it was a go, once we decided that it was happening, kind of the way any film comes together is that like all stars align to make it happen. And we had an amazing support group, and we had an amazing crew that came on board and that worked well together. So it felt really fast.
Yeah,
fast.
It's really fast, and a lot of that's actor dependent. Like a lot of times it's, okay, we have amazing actors, they have this block of time. For indies, this block of time, they can do it this window, and you have to either pull the trigger and go or say no, and at that point you're like, oh my God, we're going.
Yeah,
so,
and on this one in particular, we had both the leads, who are, as you all know, because you just watched it, phenomenal. They had tricky schedules that we had to work around. So our production schedule was actually really wonky We shot days that we didn't think we could shoot. We had odd weeks. It wasn't your traditional kind of easy to go shoot. But, and I'm sure you'll get into this later, Brian loved the lead actor, Ryan, and Ryan was somebody that we really wanted to accommodate and to make work. And his schedule, because he's amazing, was just all over the place at the time. And we were lucky to get him and lucky to have made it work. But because of that, it made pre-production a little tricky because we had to jump through a lot of hoops just in terms of like, we can only get this location at this time, or we can only have this, scene at this time, or Michelle wasn't available, or she is available, who Michelle is also just one of the nicest people in the world. But pre-production was only tricky because we had two phenomenal actors that we both really wanted to make it work with that were both busy working, That's
a good problem to have. Let's talk about a little bit of the casting for our actors in the room. You worked with an amazing casting director. Go ahead and talk about your relationship with that person and who that was.
So the casting director for this is Dorian Frankel, who we actually know each other from acting class. We were in acting class together. I don't want to date myself, but it's been a while. And stayed in touch, and she cast my first movie, Let Go, and just did a phenomenal job with that. And it was one of those situations where I reached out to her again and said, "Hey, I know you're a big deal now, but what do you think about the script?" And she happened to like it, and I just feel so fortunate to work with her. She's really fantastic. In terms of casting, Ryan is somebody who I'd seen in a Sundance film called The Dry Land. I'd seen him in Brooklyn Brothers Beat the Best, which was he wrote and directed and premiered at Toronto. And I loved him. He's, in addition to being a great actor, he's also a very busy writer-director. And I didn't think we would get him. We almost didn't offer it to him. It's like, I'm like, there's no way he's going to do this because he's super busy. But then he liked the script, and we sort of worked around that. And Michelle actually came in and read for us. She was the very first person to audition. And it was that, as a writer-director, one of the hard things about, when you have auditions is you never know whether what you're trying to communicate on the page comes across to actors, right? So then she came in and was amazed. It's like, oh my God, people totally know this character. Oh, it's like so clear. She absolutely nailed it. And then subsequent people came in and it's like, oh no, they don't know this character as well as Michelle. And we read a lot of people for it and ended up going with Michelle.
As a writer, do you have specific prototypes in your head or see certain aspects, or are you just kind of a blank slate and see kind of what comes in the room to influence you?
With this type of project, in terms of, I didn't have any sort of physical attributes in mind, but I had a very clear image in my head of who these people were. I mean, sort of more at an emotional level. So in terms of physically, absolutely not. One of the things with Michelle, she was under the impression that this character is written for an Asian American, and it wasn't. It was not that on the page at all. And she just intuitively, because it's such a complex character to get to know in terms of her sort of vulnerability and all those things, and she just intuitively knew it, which was more important than sort of, imagining physical types for those roles.
I'll also just step in as, Brian is obviously the writer and director. Having read it on the page, I envisioned the character a certain way, and I was there with him when we were casting. And as he said, Michelle was the first person to walk in, and she came in and she turned the chair around and she put a piece of gum in her mouth because her first scene was in a cafe. And we looked at each other after she left, and it was just like, she nailed it. And I think there is something to be said about the writing on the page. You write something and you have a character, and to Brian and I, it was so clear who this character was. And Michelle just got it. And it was so clear that she got it that there were other very talented actresses that we saw that did amazing performances that we made, that made us second guess our own kind of thoughts. But at the end of the day, when you see somebody who so clearly understands the character that was written, when such a strong character is on the page, it's really cool. It's a great thing to see.
Speaking of her and the other actors, was there things that even though, because there's only one person that can get it, what stood out for you of like, okay, this actor, even though we're not going this route, made it difficult decision for you? What were some of those aspects? Was it interpretations? How was it that they made tough decisions for you as a director and producer?
I'm going to go first just because I think my answer will be easier. There were amazing performances that we saw in auditions. It actually, although Michelle is the one that we went with ultimately, it was not an easy decision, and we had many conversations about which way to go with it. I think the hardest part about casting is that each actor brings something new. And that's the most fascinating part about telling a story. It's you have something in your brain and you have something that you think that you wrote or that you hope was kind of portrayed. And each person that comes in that room reads it a different way or sees it a different way. And all of those things make you question that character. And they bring such choices that you're like, oh gosh, how fascinating and how interesting. And I think Michelle ultimately, at least personally, Brian might feel differently, although she was the first, was the one that was closest to how I personally envisioned the character and how I perceived her. But it was a very difficult decision based on some of the, like I said, extremely wonderful choices that were made.
Yeah, and I think Steph brings up a really great point when you're doing stuff as a writer, director, is because the stuff, again, is so clear to you in your head, and often you get just amazing actors that come in, and it's not exactly the way you've heard it. So I think it's harder during production because you don't, movies like this, you don't have any rehearsal time. So you're trying to gauge in your head, all right, this is a little different from when I imagined. Is it better? Is it helping it, or should I stick to my guns and oftentimes I think if you are comfortable enough in your own skin and who you are, going with actors that bring their own thing to it is phenomenal, because you can only improve on the baseline where you started, which is what you hope for.
Let's talk a little bit about production. So you mentioned it, kind of a weird schedule. Talk a little bit about that schedule. How many days did you shoot? What was the schedule like? Locations? You guys shot in Los Angeles. Where did you shoot? All those type of things.
So Koreatown is a big character in this film, so a lot of it was shot in and out of Koreatown, and we had to, as any low-budget film kind of goes, play with schedules. If somebody says you can have our location at this time, you're like, we will be there, no matter what that means. That was most of the shoot. It was being where people said we could be, when people said we could be there, coupled with any production has its pitfalls and drama. Like we had a couple locations fall out at the last minute, and we had to scramble to fix them. I think LA is both one of the best places in the world to shoot because phenomenal crew. Here. Thank you so much for being here. And also one of the worst places to shoot because everybody's shooting. That means every, bodega or restaurant knows that they can overcharge you for something. So production's tricky when it comes down to it. But I think what Brian said earlier is when you have a really great story and a really great script and you bring on a crew of people that believes in what you're doing, because you have to at this budget level, the world works to make it happen for you, and we got really lucky in the fact that it did.
Yeah, I think technically the shoot was 16 days, but because we didn't have a budget to set up base camp in a lot of spots, a lot of it's shot in Koreatown, we had to do a lot of shuttling back and forth from other base camp or from where we could park. So it was 16 days, but I would say realistically it was probably 15 we probably lost a day or two just in terms of having to deal with the reality of our budget. Except for the time lapse. The time lapse took a lot longer.
There are some time lapses in this film. Brian shot those personally, so if you liked the time lapse, you can always congratulate him later. Those took a long time, mainly because we shot them outside of the production schedule and it was just Brian, and so technical shoot days, I don't know. You can ask Brian on that one.
The time-lapse stuff is tricky because you're moving in time-lapse and it's also the camera's moving. So I think each of them took about 20 tries, and I still wasn't happy with them. But in those 20 tries, it's still a day because you only get sunset at one time a day, right?
This is a 40-day shoot.
Yeah. I'm still shooting the time lapses. I will get it right someday. I will get those things right.
Spoken like a true director. It's not right yet. In production, being on set, you have to be the ultimate improviser because what will go wrong usually does go wrong. So, two perspectives. One is that the production producer, behind the scenes of some things that you had to change. Talk a little bit about that. You mentioned sets, but anything else? And then from a director, did you have scenes you planned to shoot certain way that because of X, Y, and Z had to be changed? Just kind of talk about the ways you guys had kind of have to improv on set, a little behind the scenes to the final products we saw to best understand the craziness.
Well, I mean, the craziness is a lot of those scenes, especially in Koreatown, we didn't have locations locked. We were like, okay, we're shooting this scene today, but we don't literally driving to go shoot. We don't know where we're shooting. I think that was much of the exterior of Koreatown. So certainly improvising there, you know, like the scene where they're talking at night with the balls overhead, that scene, we didn't know we were shooting there until we actually showed up.
Neither did I, and I'm pretty angry about it.
Yeah, that wasn't.
That was not an approved shot?
Yeah, that was not a. Because we shot on the. Film allows you to do like what's called a grid. So you basically mark off on a map within a grid where you can sort of shoot different things. So a lot of it was, all right, we have this grid. We'll sort of find like the park bench scene was another one where we didn't. It's like, oh, what about that bench? Looks good. Let's go. We have
some of the most beautiful shots of this movie are stolen.
It's getting dark. We have an hour to shoot that scene. So stuff like that, and then invariably, as Steph said, on indie films stuff, oftentimes you're pulling favors from restaurants and other places. So invariably they fall out, and you have to replace them. You know, Cooper's apartment was a place that fell out, and we ended up having to use Steph's apartment. So if you want to produce indie films, you have to be willing to shoot in your own apartment. So that's a great lesson.
It's very true. Also, I think just in going back to kind of like creating a script and creating something that is easily, or at the very least doable on a low budget, it's that if a location fell through, or if we didn't get it, or we had to steal it, which don't ever do, the scenes weren't necessarily beholden to one location. So if a location fell through, we had a creative conversation that was like, okay, well, if this doesn't happen at the park, can it happen at this location? Or if it can't happen in this location, can this conversation happen at a park? And the script was written and the characters were written in a way that it didn't necessarily matter if it was taking place in a restaurant or a park. It was about the conversation. And that makes it so much easier to make a budget on this level. It's that it's getting it on the screen that matters. It's not each specific location being so specific. This wasn't a hospital. This wasn't a police station. It was houses, parks, and restaurants.
Let's talk a little bit about post-production. How did you feel that you set yourself up or did not set yourself up for post, specifically editing? Did you anything in pre and production that you felt like you did well to help in moving into post, or did you feel like I wish I would have done X, Y, and Z?
I feel like we set ourselves up pretty well. I mean, we had conversations with Michael Kudo, our editor, early on about, because on this budget you don't have the budget for a post-production supervisor. So I said to him early on during the hiring process, is like, look, you're gonna have to wear multiple hats on this project just by the nature of what it is. So he was very good about sort of keeping track of post workflow, which was great. And I think with indie films, post it just takes a little bit longer. You know, we did sort of a few test screenings here and there with just friends and that kind of thing. Which just takes time. Because I think the one big lesson for post for indie films is you've worked your butt off to raise the financing and then shoot it, and then you're just, you know, you're proud of it and you want to get it out there. And I think one of the biggest lessons is not to rush post, because I think, you know, like Sundance this year got 8,000 submissions, something like that. And unless you have, like, you know, big budget, big production, you're just competing with a whole different ball game. So to really, if we did anything, it was to try to be realistic about our timeline, and then try as best we could to not rush it to some artificial deadline.
Just to add, I think the biggest kind of blunder that people make when they're doing independent films is not a budget for post-production. So a lot of people are like, oh, we'll figure that out later, or we don't need music, or, you know, like color, like it's not like a sexy budget line, you know? It's not like, yeah, let's put like a bunch of money over here, something later, but it's so important. And I think that's something that we always talked about and we're very cognizant of, is that budget costs, or post costs money, and we have to make sure that that exists in our budget.
Yeah, because it's when you're going through and you're trying to hit a fixed number on a budget, it's the easiest place to start taking, like, oh, we can just trim a little bit here. It's the easiest place to trim because you don't have to deal with it till later. So don't do that.
You mentioned it about the artificial deadline, which is great. Talk a little bit about, did you have certain film festivals in mind? Did you feel like you were going to target certain ones once it was completed? Talk about, did you just send it to your standards? Talk a little bit about the process of film festival selection.
Maybe this is, our target was actually making sure we had the right talent. So we shot it at a time in which we could really get the talent that we wanted, and that was, I think, untraditional in the sense that a lot of people were like, oh, we can only shoot this now, because then we shot it because we knew we had amazing actors that were available, and that's why we shot it. Film festivals, like, we were so lucky and amazed that Austin Film Festival was like, yes, please screen it, and like we got to screen the opening night of the festival, which was a huge honor, and for that we were really grateful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing about festivals is, I sort of knew this coming in, and I think Steph did too, is you have to be very realistic about festivals. I mean, I think I knew from the get-go the odds of a movie on this scale with personally, I think Ryan and Michelle are stars, but compared in the relative world, I thought from the beginning, like, our chances of getting into Sundance or somewhere like that were very, very low. It's just the nature of the festival circuit these days. So, like Steph said, I think it was more important of sort of getting the pieces together and casting right, rather than unrealistic expectations about, oh, you know, we're gonna premiere at Tribeca or South by or any of those festivals. And it turns out Austin was a great fit for us, so it worked out really well.
We're going to wrap up what we call the kind of final golden nugget question. So from a producer's point of view, from the director's, writer's point of view, if someone was watching this or here in the audience and didn't get anything that we said tonight, what was the one or two things that you would want to leave them with as they maybe go work on their film projects?
I just have a question. Your question is like a general, like, go work on your own, or about this one?
Or specifically from your just experience working on this one, what's some advice you would give? Like, if you remember one thing, remember this.
Work with great people. Work with people that you trust, that you admire, and that you can be vulnerable with. Because I think with every film, whether you're the producer, whether you're the director, the cinematographer, the production designer, or in this case, the actor, you want to work with people that you can be scared around or nervous around or self-conscious around, and have that be okay. You want every set, you want every film, you want it all to be a safe place. And if you have a safe place, that's going to provide you with the opportunity to truly come up with the best solution. If it's a creative solution, if it's a production solution, if you're in an environment where you don't feel safe, you're going to be closed off, and the best work isn't going to come out. So my advice would be in a safe place, work with people that you admire, you adore, and that you ultimately really trust.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. I mean, I hope when people see a movie of this scale, and it empowers them, because if we did it, so can you. So, I mean, the best advice I can give about indie filmmaking is just do it, because it's like acting, right? You can read all the great technique books in the world until you've gotten on stage and said those words. It's not the same thing. I would say also, it's really important to be realistic about what your goals are in terms, and what I mean by that is, like, are you making a film because you want, you can make the festival stuff? Do you want to get into Sundance? Is that really important to you? Are you trying to get exposure? I think being realistic with yourself at the outset, so your expectations are realistic, is really helpful, because because otherwise it's it's a great comparison to acting. I think a lot of people who move to LA, they just get here and like, oh, I'm going to get an agent, I'm going to be a movie star, all that stuff. That sure, it happens for 1% or 1/10 of 1%, but for the most people, it's about building a career and doing a guest role here and then working your way up. And the same is true of indie filmmaking. I think you got to be realistic about the chances of you being the next Sundance darling or whatever. Sure, it could happen, but the reality is make your project, make it as the best you can, and then move on to the next one and keep doing it and keep doing it. And then eventually you'll have a career. And I think that's true of all creative people, whether you're an actor, writer, director, whatever it is.
Let's give them say thank you for their sharing their story.
I also wanted to thank the SAG-AFTRA Foundation for having us. It's just such an